end of term. Our guest today is Kate Gilmore. Kate is the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. Prior to joining the OHCHR, Kate was a key player in Amnesty International. Her work over the years has focused on prevention of violence against women. Please join me in welcoming her with a warm round of applause.
Oh, look, that's what you said. Righto. Yeah. Thank you. Cool. Wow. Thank you so very much. See, I was betting no one was going to turn up. I'm thinking it's end of term. You've got stuff to do. You've got places to go, people to see. And I didn't think one of them would be called Kate Gilmore. So I'm sort of really grateful and only a little bit resentful. I don't mean that. I thought I might have got out of it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you everyone for the privilege of the conversation that we are to have. I'm deeply grateful. I'm extremely honoured. And of course, it's an incredible venue to stick my nose into and to shoot my mouth off in. And for the privilege of that, I'm truly grateful. None of which would have been possible if you hadn't found the time, squeezed out the time to turn up and give us the benefit of the exchange. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, it matters a lot that we meet together under shelter and not under shadow. Under shelter of a university. Universities being amongst the pillars of democratic life, democratic system, intriguingly not always recalled as being part of that system of buttress and support, securing and enabling functioning, quality, values-based democracy. It's strange that universities are forgotten often in analysis and critique of how values are upheld, of how people are brought together into community, of how truth is discovered, evidence created and established, verified and corroborated, the building blocks of the certitude societies need to function smoothly, well, to contain the instinct that the human condition has frequently indulged for great cruelty. You know, that sense of shelter is ages old in university. At least one account of it is of a story over a millennium ago, at exactly this time of year, in fact. Following, it is said, violent attacks on the streets of Paris, teachers and students barricaded themselves into the Latin Quarter, the Latin Quartier. And in manifestation of that protest and of their shared sense of being under threat, they formed a union, a universitas. And the next day, they went to power. And they stood before the king of the day and they demanded their rights of association, their right to knowledge, their freedom to think, their freedom to learn. The king is a bit pissed off, frankly. Who are you bastards to be making this demand, he said. Don't tell anyone I use this language. It's because I'm feeling a bit comfortable, but back in the UN they don't like it. But the king sang to the teachers and students in this new union, this universitas. He says, well, I'm not that persuaded. You're upstarts. And they said famously, you either protect our rights or we shall shake from the hem of our gowns, academic gowns, the dust of Paris. The king, being a pragmatist, understood that in fact the connection between academy, teachers, students, young people, polity and city was so intimate and so essential that he could not afford to do other than affirm the universitas, the union. The union. Have you seen, I don't know, far more recently, have you seen in the press that immediately after the election of Bolsonaro as president of Brazil, 20 universities were invaded by military police, searching out curriculum, searching out lecturers, searching out students, specifically to remove all literature, anti-fascist, all literature on activism. 20 universities. It seems that some don't consider the ecology of fundamental freedoms, that is the lifeblood of the universitas, teacher, youth, city, public participation, to be at the heart of democracy. But when the university is amongst the first cabs off the rank of those targeted for vicious attack by opponents of freedom, strange, albeit vicious, compliment is paid. A compliment is paid in affirmation of the central place that union in our communities, of that union in our communities and in our demos populace. Friends, thought itself, speech, are multiple expressions as thinking, reflective, analytical beings. These are just qualities as inherent to our dignity as hunger satisfied is, as thirst quenched. We long for justice as we hunger for food. And those longings for fairness, for knowledge, for fact, for truth, these have to be defended as means too of our liberation. The frequency with which the university is subjected to political thuggery, the courageous examples of academics who defend academic freedom even unto cost at their own lives, and the repeated, irrepressible, unparalleled role that students have played in social movements and liberation, for liberation, down through the years. All of that is evidence about why places like this are just so critical for the shape, the exercise, the expression, the taste, the feel of democracy. The individual social and political freedoms, the human rights on which democracy depends, for the quality of systematic collective thought on which its advance relies, for the dissent, the debate, the engagement, the participation, that's the very stuff of participatory democracy. Universities must, and we need it to, provide shelter, not shadow. We have to figure out how to preserve difference, enshrine debate, enable dissent, and protect the freedoms of thought, speech, expression, assembly, association on which this depends. Because it's here, in places like this, that we can teach lawyers who cherish the rule of law, who will defend equality before the courts, will stand up for judicial independence, journalists who will love the truth, who will prize evidence and protect fact, doctors who will give dignified access to essential care regardless of a patient's identity or social standing, scientists who will pursue knowledge without fear or favour, and then deploy its fruits for the betterment of a planet under strain, a climate undergoing horrendous change, a people undergoing inconceivable suffering. In places like this, we need to be taught artists who will disturb, provoke, illuminate, and enchant. We need philosophers who will erode our ancient habits of, when fearful and anxious, exercising such grave cruelty one against the other. We need political scientists who will speak the truth to power, and when their turn at power comes, will listen well when the same is spoken to them. If helping build those such competencies on which sturdy, inclusive, responsive, participatory democracy then may stand firm, the university must be also understood as a portal, an opening way to public political participation for its student body. It's simply the case that for scientific, literary, artistic, or indeed technological breakthrough, we need students. There is almost no social movement in history of any remark and consequence that has not had at its heart students. William Wilberforce began his activism aged 21. 21. It was his activism and that of others around him that led eventually to the Manchester Anti-Slavery Committee petition that was then signed in 1806 by a remarkable 1 in 5 Mancunians. 1 in 5, 1806. Activism, protest, standing up. Emmeline Pankhurst was 14 when she started in the women's suffrage movement. Serbia's Otpori youth movement resistance that ousted war criminal Slobodan Milosevic was a youth movement. It was a movement of students. It was teenagers, students, who scrawled on the wall of a town in Syria, "People want the regime to fall," whose then subsequent incarceration for that graffiti and their torture and their loss of life, it was there that began what we now know as the Syria War. It was a direct oppressive act against students that gifted us a conflict still underway 8 years later. From Hong Kong to Venezuela, Turkey to Zimbabwe, student leaders are standing up, supported by students who are standing up, supported by young people who are standing up. And without that movement and that tradition, God help us all. You know, globally, today there is the largest generation of young people the world's ever seen. But 90% of them are located in places where you couldn't be further from the tables of decision-making and influence. Does anyone know the median age of Germany? 47. The median age of Japan? 50. The median age of parliamentarians? 53. The median age of billionaires not involved in technical side? 73. The median age of Niger? Uganda? Anybody? 15. 15. Stop and think about the demography of power. Think about where young people are today. In every conflict, Syria, Central African Republic, Yemen, South Sudan. In each and every situation, the majority of the people are aged under 25, more often aged under 20. These are wars that you could well be in the middle of. And for some of you, you no doubt are well connected to through family and friend and history. They're wars of young people, played out over the backs of young people, young people losing their lives, unremarked, unseen, untroubled by those with the power and the privilege of the middle-aged. This is one of the most urgent issues of our time, that young people are locked out of decision-making, concentrated where despair is gravest, forced into situations where they are deprived of education, deprived of health, deprived of shelter, deprived of hope, pushed onto the roads of migration, only to be greeted at the borders of ageing, anxious communities with contempt, with bigotry, and with hatred. We have to make of this demography of power a rupture. We must make the most of this youthquake. Oxford, a dictionary, a certain dictionary, whose name I can't recall, said youthquake, said last year, youthquake was its word of the year, the word of the year for 2017. Einstein, who actually made, I should say, some of his greatest discoveries while still very young, said simply that you can't solve your problems with the same thinking that you created them with. We need new thinkers. We need different thinkers. We desperately need younger thinkers. Today, in a digital age, youth is a competency, not merely an identity. We certainly can't continue on with our current leaders' callous, casual contempt for the other, with hatred of the foreigner, with this baseless distrust of those who look or love or worship differently, with clampdowns on freedom of the press, with encroachment on public movement, with closure of national borders against those fleeing persecution, with gagging of activists, with the denial of life-saving essential services for sexual and reproductive health. It's a fallacy that borders, walls and fences erode our obligations one to another. Walls within the human family on a small distressed planet in a globalised world, home to the largest population of youngest people in the world, walls are untruths. There is no country on this planet at this time in this interconnected world that can rightfully stand apart, bury its head or absent itself from the community of effort to meet our challenges. Where do rights fit in? They're just values. And they're the operating manual for a more humanised relationship between power and powerlessness. If Gray's Anatomy gives us a codification of musculature and physiology, rights simply provide typology for dignity. Head up and neck down. So that I might hold my rights in relationship to yours. Anyone who's can recall being sent to bed earlier than an older brother or a sister, even when very young. Anyone who has a kid in the family, a child, say a 3-year-old, sent to bed earlier than a 5-year-old, knows how natural is this sense of what is unfairness. How profoundly deep within us. I don't need to be told I have rights. I need to be told you have rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I don't need it to know, get off my back, get out of my way. Don't be telling me what to do. I don't need that. I need it to know that you have rights. And I need to know it, I need to find a way to understand, and clearly most people need a lot of help in this regard, to hold my rights so that your rights are not denied, so that you can hold your rights without encroaching on mine. Your rights to freedom of thought, to freedom of expression, to love and worship and to believe whatever you like. your rights to shelter, to health, to food, to water, so that you can have in your arm's reach the essentials for a life of dignity. Your rights to a free trial, for it is on that all rights depend. Your right not to be tortured, not to be disappeared, not to be extrajudicially executed. For that is the pathway, a toxic pathway, of descent into atrocity. Your right to speak up, to stand up, to speak out. Codified now in law all over the world, taken into constitutions. Most of the world's constitutions that have been established since 1948, recognised in every corner of the world. Since 1948, human rights has spread to every corner. No value system has ever spread so far, so fast, to so many. I sat once in Nicaragua with a 14-year-old girl sitting across from me. She had on her knee a 3-year-old, and at her, bigger pardon, she had on her knee a baby, and at her feet a 3-year-old. 3-year-old actually was very hyperactive and clearly pretty demanding. The baby was of her boyfriend. She had had the baby, within the previous 6 months, but her boyfriend had left. He had become violent and abandoned her, and she too had run so that he might not find her. The child of 3 was the product of a rape by her uncle. At 10, when she knew she was pregnant, she had gone to seek medical care to bring that pregnancy to termination. The state denied her that care. She was immediately threatened with criminalisation for even requesting the information. Think, raped by your uncle, pregnant at 10. You knew that your body would rupture if you carried that pregnancy to term. This is where we get the challenges of fistula and irreparable damage to the reproductive system. And the only response was to threaten with criminalisation. She cried and cried as she told me that story. And I said, oh, please, why are you telling yet another, I don't know, the white, worried and well, anxious old woman with a bad attitude to authority? She said, no, I'm telling you my story because I believe people like you can make a difference. You might not believe in you. God knows sometimes I don't believe in me. She believes in you. That people like you and me, in all this privilege, in all this possibility, can make a difference. What difference will you make? 70 years ago, George Orwell set out a very dystopian view of what the world would be like were there to be pursued thought control, thought police, policing of freedom of thought. In the same year he completed the novel, the governments of the United Nations drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Both are 70 years old. What's remarkable about the UDHR is it's only one of many efforts by humankind to express this relationship between power and powerlessness. The Magna Carta is one of the most famous, but it's only one. There was the Mandan Charter of the African subcontinent, but before, in the same year as the Magna Carta, 13th century. But before the Magna Carta, 6 centuries before the time BC, as it was referred to, Cyrus of Mesopotamia set down on the scroll, you can see it in the British Museum, a promise to respect your freedom, to respect freedom of movement, freedom of thought, freedom of belief. The African Magna Carta actually promised gender equality in the 13th century. You know, in the 16th century, when Shakespeare wrote one of his final plays, he put in the words of Thomas More a denunciation of London's xenophobic riots. He called London's xenophobia a mountainous inhumanity. How dare anyone talk about rights as a modernity project alone? How dare people say, oh, it's the West against the rest? You know, rights are no more modern or Western than wrongs are only of the rest or somehow a new invention. What is clear is throughout time, for rights to be upheld, you've got to get off your seat. Rights are verbs. Rights are things you stand up for. Rights are things you use to defend. You use your rights to defend someone else's rights. Yes, they may lock up the justice-loving lawyer, and they do. They hunt down the courageous human rights defender and attack. Yes, they may char every word. They may burn every page. And in history, they try. But still, even so, even then, there are those who will stand up. Who will stand up for rights, not simply for their own, but for yours and for mine. What difference are you going to make? There's no fences to be set here. Fences have no place in our world. We're interconnected. We're interdependent. It's time to lower the fist. It's time to reach out the hand. Come on, stand up. Voila.
Thank you very much for those moving words and that very animated, almost call to arms. And I think that kind of leads on to my very first question, because I felt there was a theme running through your speech about the emphasis on youth and how youth can make a difference. And how do you think, what advice would you give to us as sort of young 18 to 21-year-olds to get off our seats and how we can actually actively make a difference to people in other countries and also in our own country?
You know, I wouldn't presume too much, but most humbly, the first thing I would ask you is what burns in you? What is your passion? Interrogate it. What will be your eternal flame? What is your renewable energy? So that come the barrier and the obstacle, the defeat and the disappointment, you will come back to that struggle. If you don't know what burns in you, then you cannot be part of the solution. Whatever solution you then pursue. Know where that eternal flame is. For me, it was simply outrage. I could not believe that the world should be organised by genitalia, skin pigment, and the dumb luck of where you were born and the faith into which you were born. I could not believe I was being sold that nonsense. I still am repelled by it to my very core. And here I am at 60. I can feel that 18-year-old in me. And I think I'm still trying to say to her that she would not be ashamed. Know what burns in you. Where's your outrage? If you have none, shame on you. Shame on you. Know what your outrage is. I don't mind what it is. It's not for me to say. But if you don't burn with something, you will go nowhere important. And you will go nowhere constructive. The burn is not enough, but without it, you will be lesser than what you can be. And then, of course, equip yourselves. Equip yourselves with a shared agenda, not just an individual agenda. You know, the remarkable thing about the tradition of rights is that if we look, for example, at the Magna Carta was cast almost contemporaneously with the Charter of the Forests. Are you aware of that? It was a commitment to some idea of the commons, and it was an agreement between power and relative powerlessness, that people were entitled to access to field and to livestock and water systems and so on in order for a dignified life. Somehow in our societies, I think we've reduced rights to a project of the individual, and this was never as it was conceived. It is a relational project, and it is about a common interest. So don't travel alone with your burn. If you want to travel far, you always travel together.
And you touched on sort of feeling outraged, and like the story you told about the 10-year-old from Nicaragua. I can't believe that something like that could happen. And how do you go about bringing sort of change to combat sort of violence against women in countries like this politically, to protect the vulnerable?
Yeah. I mean, as human rights people, you understand a couple of things. First and foremost, people bring about change themselves. You don't import that change. I mean, it's very brave activism within Nicaragua itself, and in fact speaking out of the kind that 14-year-old did, that is really the source of any understanding of just how cruel is that idea that one should legislate against women's rights to make determination as to when and how often to be pregnant and under what circumstances. It's incredible that there is such evidence of such cruelty behind those policies, that they're still being popularised. It was the second, on his second day in office, that Donald Trump introduced a ban on all US aid that previously had been supporting access to sexual and reproductive health, life-saving services, simply in order that there be no information given about abortion and no access to abortion provided. He's imperiled more than $6 billion of healthcare subsequently, affecting research, affecting access to antiretrovirals, leading to extraordinary pushback on transgender people. Even today, there's efforts to take all reference to gender out of all UN documents. I mean, this is perverse, huh? Can you imagine? I mean, you're president of a country. On day 2, you're looking around. I'm just saying, there's the climate, there's the economy. You've got a couple of 100 million people to figure stuff out. There's a bit of disagreement on Congress. What am I going to do with my time? I know what I'll do with my time. I'll interfere with the body of the woman. What? Of all the things you want to control and do with all that power, all that responsibility, all that opportunity, day 2, you want to reach out and limit the choices in regards to the most intimate of places and the most intimate and painful and difficult and joyous of decisions. I mean, what is that? For me, born out of that young woman and those speaking out, we have movements against this sort of abuse. The thing I cannot understand is our tolerance, though. How these things, we've lost our shock factor. And that's why I do feel we have to own responsibility for outrage. And we have to remain completely intolerant of the intolerable. This is a very precious and important thing. As a human rights person, you then look for tools. We have laws, and so we try and establish international norms that reveal and expose misogyny in national laws, homophobia in national laws, racism in national laws. It's not my standards. Actually, the member states have voted things like conventions against eliminating all forms of race-based discrimination. They've voted for the Convention on Eliminating All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. They've voted against torture. So it's our job to put these standards into play. It's our job to scrutinise and report. We report to the Human Rights Council on the fact that there are women languishing under penalty of 30 and 40 years imprisonment for spontaneous miscarriage in El Salvador. But we engage it as rationally as we can, and WHO reveals the epidemiological cost. We point out all the rules and laws that it violates. But at the end of the day, we're not outraged enough. And it must matter more. It must matter more.
And sort of like to get it to matter more, like with regards to sort of the Human Rights Council, what do you think the long-term impact of a big player like the US leaving it will have on the kind of work that you're trying to do?
Yeah. You know, the Human Rights Council is an orange. You can't judge it for being a bad banana. It's just an orange. It makes a very bad banana. It is a political body. It's just a gathering of member states under certain constitutional responsibility. It is not a gathering of the good and mighty. It is not designed as a court of judgment. It's an orange. That people have tried to judge it for not being a banana is less than what we would wish. But it's been done, but also more in the spirit of it being a political judgment. It's interesting that the US walked away from membership of the Council, but it has done that before. It has done that before. It did that under previous administration. It's important that the Council has continued as it did before. It's critical that member states have a place where they can cooperate on, such as the accountability mechanism that they've put in place through the Council for Syria, the accountability mechanism that will come in place with regards to Myanmar. This matters. It matters that there were 2,500 representatives of business and civil societies associated with business in Geneva this week, discussing the interplay between human rights and commerce. That's what the Council enables. It matters that every single member of the UN comes before the Council once every 4 or 5 years and has to explain their human rights record. It matters. It matters in the same way Churchill said of democracy. It's just a little bit less worse than not having it. And our job is to make that even better. But it's political. And that's what governments are, and one can get very disappointed. But it is far, far better that it exists than that it doesn't. And of course it's disappointing, regretful, that the US stepped apart from it, of course. But it goes on.
Thank you very much for that. I'm conscious of the time, so I think I'll probably open up to questions from the floor. So yeah, if you just raise your hand and wait for a steward to come to you with a microphone. Right there at the back. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask, so the internships at the United Nations are not paid for. And I wonder, don't you think it perpetuates the culture of mostly rich people governing the processes in the world?
No, not particularly, but they should be paid. I think many other things perpetuate the elitism of the United Nations, not pay for interns. But I do think pay for interns should be provided. It's something we've called for, and I hope it will spread.
All right, I'm very glad to hear this. Thank you.
A question here.
Thank you. So since the fall of the Soviet Union, we've been living in a global world with only one superpower, and that's the United States, which on the one hand does call for respect for human rights, but on the other hand supports countries such as Israel, the Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and what else, who have abysmal human rights records. But we do come to changing times, and we do have other rising powers such as China and Russia, who have no pretense at all for support of human rights. So where can we see the future, and where do you see us going in 20 years' time or 30 years' time? Thank you.
So this is a little bit my ramble on the Human Rights Council. You know, which government would you say is worthy of sitting on the Human Rights Council? Which government is worthy of today of real affirmation for their human rights record and their current policy and approach to human rights? Non-discrimination, non-xenophobia, fulfilling their obligations to refugees, to people on the move. We're in troubled times. We're in very, very difficult times. What is quite clear is that there is a major geopolitical shift happening against a backdrop of existential shifts. Climate change, globalised economy, blockchain, information moving around the world in the blink of an eye. This is unprecedented. We're the first generation that could choose to be the last. We're in times of huge transformative change. And most leadership systems and leadership practices, and in fact even things that we've been taught in management schools and so on, aren't fit for the purpose of leading bravely this world. This is a world where we need change, leadership. It's clear from history, three things matter a lot if you're to lead change well. John Kenneth Galbraith said he studied leadership, and he said the biggest challenge of leadership, political leadership, is leadership of an anxious people in troubled times. We're an anxious people in troubled times. First thing you need is courage, but not the courage of self-interest, but the courage of this commonality, the courage of the commons. The second thing you need to make sure there is a commons agenda, you need values. If you don't know where you're going, you don't know what the solutions are, you can see what should be done, but you just can't get it done. For goodness sake, know who you are. Who are we as a human species? How is it that we've allowed ourselves to be told about us, to have told about us more stories of hate than of mutual regard? That we've been represented in economy and politics and culture as more competitive than collaborative. That we found it better to accumulate and accrue than to distribute and disperse. How is it that after the financial crisis of 2008, the rich got richer? There is something fundamentally wrong and existentially unsustainable. 60% of the world's species made extinct since 1972. This is not just system error, this is system failure. In human history, it's the young that's pulled us out of the mess. It's just true. That's where innovation and invention and creativity has come. Almost every breakthrough politically, socially, culturally, literarily, technologically, has come from the under 30s. And that's why I was trying to say, I think one of the biggest opportunities for us is this largest generation of young people the world's ever seen. The thing is, in public policy, we have no succession planning. And, you know, by all means, you know, we find a stipend for interns at the UN, but it's such a small, it's an important story for those who want to be an intern at the UN, but it's a very small story. There's a much bigger story. This demography of parliamentarians of 53 and of wealthy people in their 70s and of the leaders in Europe representing constituents middle-aged, 47 and ageing, completely without any effort or sense of succession planning for the young, meaning deprived of all that creativity and that talent. For me, that's the greatest crisis. And if we could find a way for succession planning, for handing over, for old people shutting up and getting off the stage to allow for more space, then that's where hope lies. That's where hope lies.
Thank you very much for that. Just over here.
Thank you very much. There are a number of regimes and governments around the world today that either cause human rights abuses or happily turn a blind eye to them or support them, and yet still enjoy democratic support from the majority of their electorates.
Yeah.
How does that complicate the work to combat their human rights abuses?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really insightful question, and again, I think this is part of the challenge of our time. There's a confusion, I think, now in most people's minds between populist and popularist governments as opposed to democratic ones. Democracy was never about fashion alone. It's also, so this is what I elaborate, you know, started with the pillars of democracy. Electoral democracy is only one pillar, and the elision, you know, the concentration of democracy all down to a moment in the ballot box is disingenuousness on the part of those who are popularists, because democracy has been, what are its other pillars? I mean, it's a free, fair and pluralistic press. What's happened to media ownership? We've seen concentration. Where's the pluralism? We have seen a bifurcation in the meta press and an erosion of local radio, local newspapers and community. And that erosion of telling people's everyday stories has silenced a great many people and led to and made available a manipulation of these narrower media outlets so that more people fall for less truth. We need more diverse, more pluralistic, free, not less investment in public media, but free media. We need independent judiciary. And we need a judiciary that is more representative of the people. That independent judiciary is probably the last bastion. It's probably stopping many countries at the moment falling into the abyss entirely. It's certainly playing a role in the United States, a very important role of check and balance. But when you have a head of government calling the judiciary enemy of the people, it's a deliberate effort to sway, cut away at these other pillars and come back to only one idea of what democracy is. I mentioned the university as a critical pillar of democracy, because without that, rooted in evidence, sound theory, critical thinking, and dissent, where is truth to go? And then, there is no democracy without civil society. How can it be that 92 governments have introduced legislation to narrow down civil society space, to shut down organising, to prevent people from registering, to stop foreign money flowing to local NGOs, How can it be that the numbers of human rights defenders being assassinated is on the increase, and yet the numbers of court cases brought to secure justice for them is minuscule? So we have to think of democracy as being a system and an ecology, and only one of them, and only an important part, but it's only one part, is in the ballot box. And even in there, in the ballot box, we know that recent history, we've seen manipulation, even of that. So we have to think, does this make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? So we shouldn't allow ourselves to be duped into thinking democracy is about popularity in the first place. In my country, you could put a referendum out tomorrow on the death penalty, and for sure people would vote to reintroduce the death penalty. It would be popular, it would be democratic. Would it be right? No. No, because there are core values and there is law to be upheld as well.
Thank you very much for that question. Over here.
Hi, Ms. Gilmore.
Hello.
My question is about sexual harassment. There have been studies done by the Women's Humanitarian Network and Report the Abuse that reveal that the prevalence of sexual harassment in aid organizations are usually due to white middle-aged men with narcissistic traits. Now that's because the white male privilege is absurdly compounded in crisis zones. What exactly is the United Nations and its agencies doing about this problem?
Yeah, the incidence of sexual harassment within the humanitarian sector, and then the expression of that same sort of abuse of power to beneficiaries, is scandalous, shameful, and to be denounced with every fibre of our beings. The Secretary-General has made a very strong and passionate campaign of this for his own term of office. And since what I think was the unfair and politically instrumentalised attack against Oxfam earlier this year, not because Oxfam didn't have what you described very much part of its history, but because it wasn't just Oxfam, but somehow Oxfam got singled out. Since then, a lot has been done. There is a risk that it's been done primarily to protect reputation rather than to secure reform. And those of us inside the system, many of us are working quite hard together, and I think, again, with the gift of leadership support, to make sure that it is true reform. The cautionary note, and not everyone agrees with me about this, is even though I'm a feminist, and even though I am a feminist, there's nothing even though I am a feminist, and I see the world in a gendered way, I am troubled that sexual harassment as a form of abuse of power has been peeled away from other forms of abuse of power. And I would much rather we were having a conversation across the United Nations and the humanitarian development sector, in every sector, about the nature of power. And how does anybody exercise power in such a manner that if I exercise power, I don't diminish yours? That I understand the limits of my power as it comes up against yours, and that I hold that in respectful tension. Because I fear we risk eroticizing power through a preoccupation with sexual harassment without nesting it alongside xenophobia, racism, homophobia, classism. For me, it's all power. And I would rather we had had a big talk about power, rather than, even as important as it is, we've had a big talk. In the UN and elsewhere, and the hashtag #MeToo's played a really critical role in revealing the specificities, which are precious to be revealed, specificities of gender-based violence, of sexual harassment and abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. There's one here at the front.
Thank you very much. So as much as I really enjoyed your speech, and I thought it was really very strong and honest, it was something which bothered me a bit. There was kind of this classical discourse of us and them, which was somewhat present, and I don't judge that too hard because, of course, it was a very limited time, and it's unavoidable to slip into generalization. Sorry, when giving a speech. But I think that often what happens is that we kind of don't know. We feel this anger and this burn that you mentioned also, but we don't really know towards where to target it and what to target with it. And so the them is always an abstract concept, and it seems like it becomes this almost intangible force of, I don't know, evil or something, which cannot really be tackled. And I think that in this sense, isn't it preferable, or at least more profound perhaps, to focus on individual bettering and simply, how can I say, affirmating one's morality and simply, well, being a decent person on a kind of a daily basis rather than engaging in kind of activism, which means intervening into the lives of other people and kind of in this sort of pretentious way, because, well, often there's this kind of this image of the activist who tries to implement change without actually changing himself. And so I think it's also Confucius who said this, change yourself and then change the world. And so it seems to me that on a very local scale, just kind of changing and bettering yourself brings better and kind of deeper change than kind of this perhaps senseless activism, which doesn't necessarily bring anything positive.
You're beautiful and so wrong that it's really moving. No, I mean, it's lovely you said that, actually. I clearly muddled my words because I did talk about relationships and I did talk about do it together. But then I talked about human rights as a relationship. I imagine telling Nelson Mandela the answer to apartheid was to sit in his cell and better himself. Imagine telling Harriet Tubman in the middle of the slave era, Harriet, your problem is not the Underground Railway, you've got a bad attitude. You've got to get yourself sorted out and make peace with yourself. Imagine telling the Worldwide Fund, listen dudes, the fact that we've destroyed 60% of the world's species in less than 50 years, that's really only a question of inner demeanour and inner harmony. Imagine if the world was running at the same pace as it was during Confucius' time. Do you know how long it took for a letter, a piece of parchment, to move around the world at the time of Confucius? Dudes, wake up! We're staring at an abyss. There are millions in Yemen who do not know where their next meal is. You can tell the children without a meal yesterday, the day before, and the day after, the main thing is to be in harmony with the universe. Feed them. You can tell the young woman imprisoned for 30 years in El Salvador for a spontaneous miscarriage because the El Salvadorians have put in place legislation that says the minute you conceive, that fusion of sperm and ovum is more important than a woman. What shall we tell her? Don't worry, I'm bettering myself, and when you get out, I will be a better person should you ever meet me. What will we do with a planet warming at this rate? What shall we do with a consumption that's unsustainable? What shall we do with a fertility rate that we've problematized and we're sending contraception to stop women in Niger and bring their fertility down from over 6 to 2 or to barely replaceable, when we know the carbon footprint of one person born into the US is at least 11 times worse than a single child born into Niger. I'm sorry if I sound as if I'm in the missionary position. I'm not. I'm looking at an abyss. And I'm daring you to look into it, face up to your privilege, and I'm daring you to take responsibility, like we did with the fashion industry last night where I was speaking, like we did in the European Union where we were speaking earlier in the week. Wake up. We're in trouble. We can do something about it, but it is not an inner journey alone. It is a journey of cooperation, collaboration, and organisation, and a journey of finding the intolerable intolerable. Voila. I don't know why I kept saying voila. I'm in Geneva all the time. But bless you. I don't mean to take you down. I don't mean to take you down. Well, you know, clear. Yeah. Anyway, that's debate. Sorry. Whatever. I don't even know why I got the microphone. I got enthusiastic. I got outraged. Thank you.
I think we only have time for 2 more questions. However, there will be a Meet the Speaker session afterwards, so if you want to ask your question, I'll definitely try and arrange for that. So I think we'll take one from there and then one here.
This is being taped, isn't it? And filmed. This might be the last talk I ever give. It's been a very good one. Thank you very, very much. If I'm going to go down, I might as well go down in style. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think we've all been very inspired by what you're saying. We have a student who just finished his PhD who was at Cambridge until last summer. He's currently detained in South Sudan because of his activism. Yeah. His name's Peter Beer, in case. I was just wondering, how do you have any advice for how to harness that burn and get people to understand that he's one of us and to get them to do something about it?
You tell us about it, you start writing letters, you go to your MP, you start asking questions, you get questions asked in Parliament. It happens that the UK, for example, is a big provider of financial support in the form of aid to South Sudan. It happens that the UN is very implicated in the future of South Sudan. You can create quite a bit of public pressure to get a public accountability for that, and you can give me the details of his case and I will take it back into the UN system and see what we can find out and what we can do. For sure. Speak up. Speak up. Write. Document. Talk. Don't put up with it. Organise.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If you can organise industry to make garments, you can organise industry to change the world. Come on. You're smart. Let's do it.
Thank you very much for that. You could pass on the details to me at speakers@cos.org and I can forward it on. And then a final question here, I think.
Hi. Again, sort of following on from the question about sexual harassment, but not really. I just wondered, in your work sort of with reproductive rights and women's rights, what is your experience of being a woman and working with people who don't support those rights and sort of people who are hostile to that? How does it impact your work and how does it make it harder, or what's your experience?
Thank you. You know, I fear I may have not, completed my thoughts well with you around this connection between burn, outrage, and then organise, acquire knowledge and skills, and set yourself a clear destination. Just to be very clear, it's not a sort of an out of control fire. Although clearly I'm not demonstrating great control. But I can say that the business of feeling to whom are you accountable, and that's part of my question in my eternal outrage, is to who am I accountable, and by which success would I measure my advance? And I have to say, strangely, it hasn't been by jobs or promotions or whatever. It's been the sense of am I still talking with the moral clarity that at least I had as an 18-year-old, even if I haven't become much wiser? But it's very difficult, I'll admit that, and at times enormously painful. I've been the subject of very, sometimes very cruel treatment in the press. I've been, people have lobbied people in high office for my dismissal as a baby killer because of my work on sexual and reproductive health. I'm frequently told, not that I'm competent or effective, but, oh, you're so passionate. You're so passionate. Oh, you've got a lovely personality. If I wasn't a good human rights person, I'd be tempted to commit a grievous human rights violation. The next person who calls me passionate. I think as women, it's really hard to hold your place. It's very hard to speak forcefully and to speak with volume. I mean, it's actually really, really tough. And on a daily basis, the sort of it's not really diminishing. It's somehow the demeaning of that, I suppose is the better term. Diminution, but the demeaning of what takes some effort to, and some thoughtfulness and reading and care and skill and an art and craft and learning. Not. As a woman, you're just told, yeah, you know, you have a lot of passion. Maybe you should tone it down. And I find drinking helps. Can I say? I make a strength of being alone. No, I mean, I just return to this. Am I brave enough to see the world for what it is? Am I clear enough that this is intolerable? Am I doing everything in my power so that when I go to bed at night, I'm not too ashamed? These are the things I examine. But I must admit, it does take a bit of determination. And I find being very insensitive helps. Shallow and insensitive, I do recommend as survival strategies. Thank you so much for asking.
Thank you so much for those powerful words, Kate. If you could all,
particularly shallow.
If you could all join me in thanking her for her time.
No, thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, fantastic. Thank you.